Hello Year 12. Today's video we are going to be looking at the motivations behind those people that answered Urban II's call to join the First Crusade. So if you want to get that down as your heading for today, our main objectives are we're going to look at the different groups that answered Urban's call, we're going to explain why these groups had their own specific motivations, and then make a judgment as to whether or not we can actually form a conclusion or give an interpretation on this question. So this really ties in with your coursework at the moment in terms of looking at interpretations again. It's a question that if you're preparing for the exam, you're probably going to be looking at motivations of Crusaders in general. So we'll be looking at the second, the third Crusade, and we'll be able to utilise some of the evidence from the First Crusade today. So there's no essay question specifically, because remember this is part of our chronological approach at the moment. So the outline of the lesson, we're going to divide it into 4 different parts, and you've got a number of tasks which are available. So you've got task 1, 2, 3, 4, and then there is a task 5 which is partly your summary as well. So the first thing that we're going to look at is we're going to look at the 11th century world, so the world in which these Crusaders were living in, because that's going to give us a bit of context behind perhaps their judgments and their decision making. Point 2, we're going to look at the acts of persuasion, so how people were enticed and told of this idea of the Crusade. We're then going to do a deep dive into 4 different groups and try and think about whether the motivations differed between different social groups and different social classes. And then finally, we'll do a bit of a summary, interpretations, judgment, that kind of thing. So firstly, we're going to be looking at the 11th century world. Now, you've got a blank person. You can design your own, or you can use that as a general template. But I want us to try and imagine what an 11th century person looks like. And the best way of doing that is taking the information, drawing it, and creating this image in your mind. It should be elaborate. We've done things like this before. So with the 11th century world, this is the general situation. There is a very low life expectancy at this point. The previous period we call the early medieval era, and it's sometimes colloquially known as the Dark Ages, after the fall of the Roman Empire. And this is a time where famine and disease are spreading. That Europe was largely a feudal society, so this is a setup which we already know about, where we're looking at how the Normans introduced this to England, but actually the vast majority of Europe at this point was feudal in its nature. Knighthood was something that people aspired to become, so there was an aspiration to move between the social status, but that could have been quite difficult for a lot of people. Overwhelmingly, the people were largely illiterate and largely uneducated, with the exception of those people that were in the church and the very, very wealthy ruling class of Europe. News, therefore, was generally transported by messengers, usually in the form of song. We call these troubadours, who would go from town to town, and that's how they would make their money. They were essentially journalists that would move from place to place. There wasn't such a thing as a printing press, and therefore information, if it was needed to be written down, it would need to be recorded by hand rather than by any printing mechanism. Largely because people are illiterate and uneducated, troubadours therefore become the source of information. However, in the 11th century, we do see a little bit of a reduction in the amount of warfare that's taking place. And as a consequence, the population starts to grow. That's also because there's increasing trading links between Europe and other parts of the world, not obviously extensively, but also within Europe as well. So trading's starting to improve, therefore the economy starts to flourish. The church is heavily visible during this period. It's important for all people's lives. Everyone is Christian. There's no dissent whatsoever. There's no question about a different religion being used in Europe, and therefore people viewed those people in positions of the church generally with respect and authority. The Pope was God's representative in the West, the Patriarch was God's representative in the East, based in Byzantium, and that's essentially a bit of context about this 11th century world and perhaps the people that we're looking into. However, our general approach of understanding what normal people's lives were, so when I'm saying normal people, we're saying lay people, people of lower social standing, it's very, very difficult to find out their inner mindsets and inner thinkings, because they're not the people that recorded the historical events. Therefore, it's quite difficult for us to kind of get into their mindsets. Instead, we have a lot of information about those who are at the top strata, and consequently very little information about those at the bottom. In terms of circumstances and prospects by the 11th century, it does vary from region to region. So those in the north of England are going to be very, very different to southern Italians, for example. But for the purposes of the Crusades, we're going to give a collective name for the people that generally took up the arms for Crusade. We're going to call them Franks because the vast majority came from Frankish lands in northern Europe. So this individual which we're drawing and making this image of, we're going to call them Frank. It's going to be easy for us because when we're going to be talking about those that go into the Crusades from now on, we're going to be calling them Franks. I've talked already about this problem of historical record for those in lower society, and it's important that you know that the bog standard Frank that is going to take up arms for the Crusades, we know very little about. So point number 2, we're going to be looking at the acts of persuasion, so how Urban II was able to popularise his message and get his ideas across. Now, it's been suggested that the reason why the First Crusade succeeds, and a bit of a spoiler there, the First Crusade is a success for the Franks, was because Urban II successfully got his message across, so propagated his message across Europe, and he was able to get lots of important members of the nobility to his side by not just the success of the Clermont speech, but also a follow-up tour of southern and central France in the final month of 1095 and the spring of 1096. And the general message of these speeches that Urban II had in 1095 and 1096 is threefold. That it would be a spiritually rewarding pilgrimage, that this was a Christian duty to liberate Jerusalem, and this idea of an indulgence. So if they went on this particular crusade, then it would remove the Crusaders' need for penitence, and it would ensure that swift passage to heaven. So their sins essentially would be absolved. Now, this tour that he conducted after the Clermont speech was well organised, and it was extensive. He travelled for about 2,000 miles in total. Now, we don't have records of these other speeches, but we can imagine that the message was essentially similar to that of Clermont. And essentially it could be that he was repeating the same call that he did in Clermont in November of 1095. So if we're looking at why perhaps people called, were enticed by the prospect of the Crusade, we can attach some responsibility to Urban II himself. However, Urban's itinerary for preaching the Crusade, as I've already said, is predominantly around southern and central France, or the Frankish lands. And it's interesting to note that the areas where he generally travelled around didn't see a vast majority of counts and higher members of nobility take up the call to arms. There's very few individuals. The vast majority of these princes and top leaders that took up this call to arms were actually from areas that Urban II didn't travel to. So we can't attach the full credit to Urban II in propagating this message. Perhaps it's down to other reasons. And so therefore we can say that Urban II was not the predominant persuasive act. He was able to get that message to southern and central France, but how did he get, how did that message spread to other areas of Europe? Well, the answer is twofold, and again we can give Urban II some credit. What Urban II also did is he wrote letters to various different counts and princes across Europe, and we have 4 surviving accounts of correspondence. We would imagine as well that there are far more than just the 4 that we have accessible to us, but we certainly know that this personal approach to specific leading families that obviously had their own private armies would have had a great impact in encouraging people to join the Crusade. And the one on the next slide is to his followers in the Italian city of Bologna. So what I want you to do is I want you to read through the extracts, and you can pause the video. I'd like to read through the extract, which is this letter that's written by Pope Urban II to his followers in Bologna in September of 1096. And I want you to answer these 3 questions. Under what circumstances exactly will full remission of sins be granted to the Crusaders? Secondly, why might clerics or monks need to have permission of their bishops and abbots to go on the crusade? And finally, why do you think that young married men needed to have the agreement of their wives before they undertook the journey? Now, to get your answers to this once you've completed it and to check that you've got the general ideas, you can copy and paste these questions into Google, because I've taken this extract from Cambridge University's approach to historical studies, and you can type them in and it will give you the answers there. If you can't quite find them, just let me know and I'll send them out to everybody. And actually, I'll send that out on Thursday with the next video so that you've got a copy. So Urban II, on his tour, doing the letters clearly has an impact, but it's not the only way in which this message is passed on. And we know that with the lack of a printing press at this particular point, it couldn't just be down to Urban II to get this message to the vast majority of Franks in Europe. So what also happened was that preachers who listened to his message as part of his tour travelled across Europe as troubadours themselves, and they would travel from town to town passing on this message. And it seems to be the case that these speeches tended to follow the same pattern. Firstly, they would go to an open space in the centre of a town, and they would encourage local bishops, local individuals that were of significance to join them. Secondly, there would be a religious ceremony at the very start of this particular talk, and it would be followed by an open invitation to join the crusade, and they would it would be very public, so you'd see other people joining, and that perhaps would have this effect of getting other people to join as a consequence, because they can see how many people are getting involved in this. They tended to aim to arrive on a religious feast day that was relevant to the place. So it might have been on an important religious day. Lots of these speeches took place on Sundays, for example, but also on religious feast days, which were very important in the 11th century world. And finally, they tended to encourage participation by advertising miracles, things that happened when people had gone to Jerusalem, and it changed their lives and it had guaranteed their salvation and their passage to heaven. But it wasn't sophisticated in the 11th century. This is the first time that we've got a call for a crusade. It becomes more sophisticated in the later crusades. And instead, what we can perhaps say is that in 1095 to 96, a sense of euphoria led to many preachers taking it upon themselves to pass their own version of the message across. And I would suggest that you spend a bit of time pausing the video at this point and going online and finding out about somebody called Peter the Hermit, who was a very famous preacher who went around particularly areas of Flanders and northern Germany. And you can get a bit of an idea of the kind of messages that these preachers passed on to people. So this is another way in which they persuaded individuals to join this first crusade. So if we're making a summary about this, we can say that the strategy that's used by Urban II is quite akin to a modern day marketing campaign, and that's the analogy that Byram and Riley, the two historians, make. You know, we've got individual approaches to targeted areas, celebrity endorsements, dramatic events to grab attention, exploiting local links, appealing to powerful human emotions. We can see that specifically in these letters that Urban is passing on, exaggerating, using icons. So Urban was saying you should use a cross if you are going on a crusade, catchphrases, similar messages, strong follow-ups to the initial launch, so that was the tour, special offers, so the penance, if you go to Jerusalem you'll be absolved of any sins, endorsements from notable and influential figures, not just celebrity figures, so on a local level, and starting with places where your idea is already popular, so southern and central France, around that town of Cluny where the Clunate reforms started. So in terms of persuasion, it is incredibly effective, and you'll see in the next few slides just how effective this was. So at this particular point, before we go into looking at the motivations for different groups, I want you to pause the video and I want you to answer this question and just come up with some initial ideas. Why do you think Crusaders left to go to the Holy Lands? Why do you think ordinary Franks, princes, members of the church, why do you think they decided to go? And I'd like you to divide your ideas between push and pull factors. So what kind of things were pushing them out of Western Europe, wanting to make them go travel, and what things were enticing them towards Jerusalem? Okay, so pause the video and have an initial thought to do with this question. Now, in terms of going through the particular points of the motivations for different groups, we're going to do deep dives into 4 different social groupings. And these aren't the only groupings that are available. And actually, with that final one of ordinary or lay people, I'm grouping together lots of people with lots of different motivations. But what we are going to do is we're going to concentrate on princes and equivalents, so people of a very high social standing, knights, members of the clergy, and then lay people or ordinary people. Okay, and for each one, I'd like you to have a look at the mind map, make some points, find some information, and there's some questions as well for you to be thinking about with that table as to what's really motivating these particular groups. So I'd like you to complete the mind map and the table as well during the next few slides. So if we're doing these deep dives into the 4 groups as historians, what sources are available to us? Well, the answer is there's not many. There's Urban II's Sermons and Letters, and you can search for these yourself on the Fordham Internet Medieval Sourcebook. You can have a look through them. You can try and think about what kind of approaches Urban was using, and that way we can maybe understand a little bit about what perhaps might encourage people to go on a crusade. Secondly, we can look at something called crusading charters, and actually this is what the vast majority of historians are looking at when they're going through these particular ideas about motivation. So crusading charters are they're all across Europe, and their documentations are very bland. They're essentially, here is what I'm going to do, here is what I'm going to sell, here is how I'm going to fund myself, and it gives us a bit of information about specific individuals. So in terms of interpretations for this question about motivations and why people went, there isn't necessarily a consensus. There was a traditional school of thought, which was that the vast majority of people were motivated by wealth. The vast majority of people that went were doing it in search of gold and in search of riches. And that's largely comes about by what they did when they actually got to Jerusalem. There were suggestions that there was looting. There was also a suggestion that the vast majority of princes and counts that were going were disenfranchised second sons that weren't going to inherit anything. And this link was really popular in the 19th century and for the vast majority of the 20th century. Jonathan Riley Smith, who we've mentioned before as a seminal historian of the Crusades, changed that particular approach and revised it with a revisionist approach. He said that actually people weren't motivated by wealth, they were motivated by religion. And he talks about crusading as an act of love, and he really focused in on these crusading charters. He also suggested that another interpretation which holds some weight is that people were joining the crusade on family lines and with fellowship lines. So friends would tend to go if one of their friends had made this particular decision, and that actually it was down to fellowship. There was another suggestion that it was down to hysteria, that there was a sense of euphoria at this point, particularly in Flanders and in northern Germany, that led to people joining this movement. People like to feel as though they're part of a movement, and the way in which the message was spread, and particularly the actions of 1096, could give weight and could give support to this particular interpretation. The historian Morton suggests that actually the main motivation was Jerusalem itself. Almost 100% of the crusading charters mention Jerusalem as a goal. It's a consistent message. So that's his interpretation. There are other interpretations as well that this was down to chivalric notions, that there was a growing sense of chivalry in the 11th century and of the knighthood class, and it was them that were really driving forward the Crusades. They were influencing people who were of lower classes and actually forcing a lot of lower classes to join as a consequence. There's an argument by Kostick to say that actually lots of people, particularly the lower class people, didn't really have a choice. We have a small group of people who made the decision, and as not just influential figures, but figures who were in authority because of the feudal system, it actually meant that a lot of people didn't have the choice to be there. And the evidence perhaps to support that would be how many people don't complete the crusade. So many deserters, there's so many deserters during this process. Giles Constable has suggested that we can't know. That's a postmodern approach to this kind of question. It's too difficult to answer, and therefore we can't ever come up with a true judgment. And finally, another interpretation could be that specifically for the Italians, this was down to trade. This was not just to do with wealth, but also to open up commercial lines. So those are the general interpretations. For the table, we're mainly focusing on wealth and religion. And so we're looking for evidence that might support or counter those particular interpretations from the next few slides. So let's start off by looking at the princes and the equivalents. So there are supposedly 8 leading princes on the First Crusade who take up Urban II's call to arms. Caustic names 9, and there are other princes and counts as well, but these are the main 8. And we probably say there's about 200 leading magnates or leading royal figures in total. So 200 or so individuals that go on the crusade that have significant influence across Europe. You'll notice that I've used the word influence there, not necessarily wealth. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of each one, and then perhaps my judgment at the end of this. So you've got Philip I's brother, Count Hugh. He goes on the crusade, perhaps as a way of showing King Philip I's France loyalty to the cause. We spoke before in the previous lesson about Philip I's indiscretions in the 1090s, his excommunication. Perhaps this would be a way of atoning for the royal family's sins. So the reason why Hugh is perhaps going on this crusade is because he's showing loyalty to Pope Urban II, perhaps trying to curry favour. We've then got Count Robert II of Flanders, Prince Bohemond of Taranto, and Duke Robert of Normandy. Now, for these 3, we can generally make the assumption that they're perhaps doing this for wealth. The reason why we think that is with Robert II, he had close ties to Alexius I and the Byzantine Empire. He knew how richly the Byzantines had rewarded mercenaries in the past. The exact same as well with Bohemond of Taranto. He knew what mercenaries had done to particularly the southern Normans in Italy. And because he was poor, he lacked inheritance, this was a way in which he could actually earn some money. The same could be said for Duke Robert of Normandy. We know how he had financial difficulties in the 1090s. His motivations aren't completely clear, but we would generally conclude that it's down to financial reasons. We can see that these 3 individuals are from 3 different regions, Flanders, Normandy and southern Italy, but their motivation is perhaps more to do with wealth. So we've got 2 different motivations there amongst the princes and equivalents class. We've then got the remaining 4. So we've got Count Raymond of Toulouse, Stephen of Blois, Bishop Ademir of Le Puy, and Duke Godfrey of Bouillon. Those 4, perhaps the evidence is that actually it's not to do with wealth, it's not to do with currying favour, it's perhaps to do with their piety, their religion, and that actually they're doing this for religious reasons. Godfrey, for example, is an ally of Emperor Henry IV, who's had problems with Urban II. He's actually fought against Urban II, but we know that he's a deeply religious man. The same as well with Bishop Ademir of Le Puy. He's a close friend and supporter of Urban II. And the exact same with Raymond of Toulouse, another close friend and supporter. We also know that Raymond of Toulouse wanted to settle in the Holy Lands. He brings his wife and his children on the crusade. And so clearly the suggestion is that he wants to go there and he wants to become a count out there in the Holy Lands. Count Stephen of Blois is quite an interesting one. He's the son-in-law of William the Conqueror. So his wife is, he's actually brother-in-law to Duke Robert of Normandy. His wife dominated their relationship, and she was incredibly pious, very deeply religious. We think the suggestion is that he went on the crusade to please her. So from just looking at these 8 leading princes, we can probably make this conclusion, that there's no clear reason which is shared geographically or by all. That traditional school of thought that they were all disinherited second sons is outdated, it's been revised, and clearly we have a myriad of reasons amongst the very top social strata for going on a crusade, and clearly there's a personal reason for each one. Second group that we're going to look at are the knights. They make up about 10% of the fighting force on the First Crusade, and we can generally say that their motivations are either one of 4 or are a combination of these particular 4. Firstly, that the appeal of war to emerging chivalric ideals meant that the idea of a crusade going to fight was something that would be honourable and would be something that is their duty. So there was a religious motivation to going to Jerusalem, obviously, but tying that into the ideas of chivalry were important. Urban II really wanted as many knights to be involved in this. He knew how important their fighting style could be against the Seljuk Turks, so he wanted to try and encourage as many of this particular group as possible. And we do know, by specifically looking at crusading charters for a lot of these knights, that they were appealed with the religious motivation of the crusade. They were also tied to their lords, so if they had a leading magnate, so one of the individuals on the previous slide or many others, that they would be forced to go on the crusade, so they might not have even had a choice. There is certainly the connection as well that lots of knights who were brothers or had family connections tended to go on crusade together, and that meant that they could work together, they could live together, they could share resources and pool their ideas together. We'll see this develop over the course of the next 100 years with the idea of orders or knightly orders, so things like the Templars, for example, and the Hospitallers. The final reason is that a lot of knights from Cluny and around that particular area tend to go on the crusade, so there is also that geographical connection. Now, settling didn't appear to be a motivation. Only a very small percentage of knights ended up settling in the Holy Lands. And we know that it's not to do with wealth. They're not as, they don't have as much money as the leading magnates. And we know that it was incredibly expensive to fight on a crusade. I mean, Robert of Normandy, we know, took a loan from his brother William II to go and fight on the crusade. But with knights, for example, it was about 5 or 6 times an average annual salary to actually raise the funds to go on this crusade. So we know that it's not to do with wealth for knights. And the suggestion generally is the case that they had this religious chivalric motivation. In terms of clergymen, there's an obvious answer. The obvious answer is that they did this for religious reasons. Clearly that's their job, clearly that's their main goal in life, and this would ensure, particularly through penitence, that they would have a swift passage to heaven. However, don't just think that clergymen were just motivated by this. They were equally motivated by other factors. So, for example, Bishop Odo of Bayeux, who we know very well from our Norman studies, he goes on the call for the First Crusade. He was an ambitious man. We know that he had motivations in terms of securing land and securing wealth. And we also know that he was tied politically and financially with Robert of Normandy. So clergymen weren't just going by themselves, they were going with knights, with leading magnates, and their motivations perhaps were as much political as they were religious. The final group of people that we're going to do a deep dive into are the ordinary or lay people, and we know that these make up the vast majority of people that went on the Crusades. So if we're making a judgment as to why do people go on the Crusades, perhaps we should be focusing predominantly on this group. The reason being is because they're the vast majority of people that went. We think there's about 22,000 well-equipped foot soldiers. So these are bog standard Franks, not necessarily not of the knightly class, who take up arms and decide to go and fight. There's also another 22,000 individuals who are poorly equipped foot soldiers. Now, within that group, you've also got the wives, children, entire families went on the crusade, elderly pilgrims, prostitutes, criminals. This is a myriad group. This is incredibly diverse. We think there's about 20 different languages that are spoken by the ordinary lay people that decide to go. And obviously there's going to be individual motivations in that group. The suggestion obviously is if they're from maybe a poor background, that by going on a crusade they would be able to better themselves. But the suggestion from a lot of the crusading charters and particularly from the sermons isn't necessarily that they're going to find riches there. They're going to find that they'll get salvation. And if they do die, their life will be internally better by going to heaven. So it's not, again, straightforward to say that they're doing this because of wealth. In terms of where we can look for information about ordinary and lay people, We're not going to look predominantly at the events of the First Crusade itself. The reason being is because most of the chroniclers, most of the individuals that are writing about the First Crusade tend to talk about the higher social strata of groups, and the ordinary person wouldn't have written a crusading charter. Where we're going to look for individual motivations or motivations as a whole is looking at something that took place just before the First Crusade. It's called the People's Crusade. And it was a movement that wasn't necessarily encouraged by Urban II. It was sparked by the same guy that we've mentioned before, Peter the Hermit, who was this radical preacher. And it took place between 1096 and 97. It's a failure. The vast majority of people that go on the People's Crusade die on their journey. They die just outside of Byzantium, or Constantinople, as you could call it. But the vast majority of people that are going are predominantly from this ordinary or lay group. Now, that isn't to say that they're just in that group of ordinary lay people. There are some knights that go, there are some leading magnates that go, but we could generally say there's about 30,000 people that go on this People's Crusade. And on their journey is a very interesting event that perhaps suggests why the vast majority of ordinary or lay people travelled. So on their journey to the Holy Lands, this People's Crusade movement travelled through the Rhineland region of Germany, so that's West Germany. And whilst they were there, they killed thousands of Jewish people in what we call a pogrom. So a pogrom is an example of the mass extermination of Jewish people. Now, the suggestion as to why they might have done this is that actually they weren't motivated necessarily on grounds of wealth, or necessarily on the grounds of going to Jerusalem. Perhaps they saw it as a crusading motivation to rid the world of anyone that didn't follow the same religion as them. And there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that those that were involved in the People's Crusade didn't necessarily know the difference between Jews and Muslims. So this wasn't necessarily an attack on Muslims to go to Jerusalem. It was an attack on any heathen, anyone that was against the Christian religion or didn't follow the same ideals. We could also suggest that those people that took part were caught in a euphoric sense. And there's quite a lot of evidence to, for those that do psychology as well, would be interested in this, on the motivations of those that become involved in riots. And again, this has been the study of a few historians who've looked at the pogrom of 1096 in the Rhineland region as perhaps an example of a riot that's just sparked further and further into this euphoric sense. And again, we could say that maybe there isn't a clear motivation of these individuals. Maybe they're just being swept into this. They don't have a clear goal at the very end. They're just going to the next day, and things are happening which are, absolutely shocking when you find out the details of what exactly this People's Crusade movement did in 1096 and 7. So from this so far, we found that the four different groups, these deep diving groups, there isn't really a clear answer in terms of their motivations. So the questions that I want you to think about at the very end of this particular video are: what problems do you foresee for the First Crusading Army as they're about to embark on the First Crusade itself? And is it worth posing the title question that you wrote down at the very start today as an inquiry? Is it possible for us to make a clear interpretation, a clear judgment on this particular question? If you want to send through your resources, that would be extremely helpful. I can see that before Thursday. And on Thursday, we'll be looking at the reasons why the First Crusade was a success for the Frankish forces. Thanks very much for listening and watching.